That kind of sounded like clickbait. Like, what could we possibly be eating 1,000% more of than we were in 1970? Well, it's not clickbait, it's real. There is an 11-fold increase in the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. And that's just from 1970 to 1990. The study was published in 2004. So we can only imagine that it's gone up more since then. Now, the creepy thing is that high fructose corn syrup, it can squeak its way into anything. It's gonna be in fruit juices, they're gonna find it in little processed cakes, it's all over the place. But what the most alarming thing about this is that there is a direct mirroring of the increase in high fructose corn syrup intake and our obesity rates. But what's really interesting is that high fructose corn syrup, or fructose in general, doesn't seem to directly equate to regular like central adiposity or regular subcutaneous like obesity. It's more linked to some other stuff. So we're gonna break it down, and we're also gonna give you some ways that you can kind of circumnavigate this a little bit more. Now, after today's video, our sponsor is Hiya. So if you've got kids, I highly recommend you check these guys out. That's a 50% off discount link for kids' chewable multivitamins that are sweetened with monk fruit. Okay, so no more of those like cruddy gummies or vitamins that you're gonna get at CVS or whatever. Like, those things have so much sugar in them, it's ridiculous. The thing about Hiya is it was formulated by a couple of dads that really saw that there was a problem. They're having a hard time getting their kids to eat vegetables, and they didn't want to give them more sugar by giving them a vitamin or something. So they said, let's create one ourselves. So it's very near and dear to me as someone that has 2 small kids, and I think it's really applicable. And they also taste good for adults too. So that link down below is a 50% off discount link off whatever you want to get from Hiya. So whether it's going to be their multivitamin, they even have a kids nighttime vitamin too that has some GABA in it, and it helps them kind of ease into sleep with a little bit of theanine as well. So that link is down below in the description, top line of this video. Just for context, that study was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It was a pretty large-scale study looking at the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. What's interesting is that high fructose corn syrup consumption has increased more than any other food group, if you want to call it a food group. So even though we've increased our consumption of seed oils, our consumption of saturated fat, as a percentage, we've increased mostly our consumption of high fructose corn syrup. Also falls in line with the mirroring of the increase in obesity. But let's unpack this a little bit more, because there's a study that was published in the journal Nutrition that really highlights where fructose could be an issue. Because what I don't want you to think is that you shouldn't be eating apples, you shouldn't be eating fruit because of the fructose content. It's not quite that easy. Fructose is problematic, okay, because in the sense that you really have to burn it. It doesn't store as muscle glycogen, right? It can store as liver glycogen, which means it can go to your liver and it can store there as carbohydrates for later use. But unlike other carbohydrates that can go to the muscle tissue and hang out for later use, we only have a small little repository of fructose, right? And it gets converted into regular liver glycogen. So it's easy to overdo it. Now, most people are not consuming 100 grams of fructose in a sitting from fruit, right? If you sit down and you eat a giant bowl of watermelon and strawberries and grapes, you'd be hard pressed to still get 50 grams of fructose. So it's really hard to overdo it on fruit. So don't get the wrong idea. High fructose corn syrup, however, is concentrated. But anyway, let's look at this study that was published in Journal Nutrition. It looked at 559 adolescents. And it was a very robust study that looked at all kinds of different biomarkers, but it also did MRIs looking at where they would store fat. What was most interesting is that there was a very clear line between fructose intake and increases in visceral adipose tissue. Visceral fat is the fat that is not the subcutaneous fat, but it's the fat that's around our organs. And visceral fat is a problem because it leaks inflammatory cytokines. It's inflammatory, which means that if you're prone to other illnesses, it could exacerbate them. It could trigger issues, right? It's definitely not good because we know that inflammation in a heightened degree is not good. Now, what else is interesting is that even when they adjusted for socioeconomic factors, when they adjusted for fiber, when they adjusted for how many calories they were taking in and all of this, even all that being adjusted for, an increase in fructose consumption led to increases in blood pressure, increases in insulin resistance, increases in HbA1c, increases in fasting blood glucose, increases in inflammation, and of course the increase in visceral adipose tissue. So independent of calories, well, that doesn't mean that you could be in a 1,000-calorie deficit and eat fructose and still have a problem. If you're in a deficit, you're probably going to override some of this, and this is where the nuance comes into play. Fructose is mainly problematic in the context of overnutrition. Just like if you were to take in 200 grams of fat in one sitting, it would be problematic. But if you took in 200 grams of fat over the course of a couple of days, it probably wouldn't be a big deal unless you were in a huge surplus already. But the concentration of fructose in one sitting, along with the fact that you're probably not just mainlining a bunch of high fructose corn syrup, you're probably having high fructose corn syrup along with a bunch of other calories, right? You go and you get a Pepsi along with your Big Mac. You see where I'm going with this. If you were to just say, all right, I'm not gonna have the Big Mac, I'm just gonna have the Pepsi, you probably wouldn't be healthy, but you probably wouldn't have the same metabolic negative impact as you would if you had the Big Mac and the high fructose corn syrup. So in order for all of this to make sense, we also need to look at a study that was published looking at fast food and how much the calories have increased over the last, since 2012 to 2016 in just simply fast food. The study was published in the Nutrition Journal, took a look at over 5,400 fast food items. They found that there was a 5% increase in mean serving size, there was a 6% increase in energy density in fast food, and a 14% increase in energy per serving. So meaning larger servings, plus more calories per serving, or energy density, a lot more calories in a given serving of fast food. So what my point is with this is that, yes, could we blame high fructose corn syrup? I think mechanistically there is merit there. But we can't just officially say it's all fructose's fault when we also have huge increases of caloric density in the food that we're eating. Because our intake of fast food has increased, our intake of processed food has increased. So you combine that with something that we know mechanistically is problematic, this is a huge, huge icing on the cake, right? Probably literally because there's high fructose corn syrup in icing. So what do we do with this? Well, the one thing we don't do is throw fruit out the window, right? That's gonna be an important piece. But the one thing we do wanna focus on no matter what is prioritizing the protein. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Even if you go to fast food, choose for the protein first. Let everything else come secondary. If you're gonna get a Big Mac, fine, but at least get double meat, triple meat, and ditch the bun or something. Prioritizing that protein changes the ratio of protein to all these other things that could be problematic. That hyperpalatable, ultra-processed stuff that seems to really be triggering an issue. There are countless times that I've gone through a drive-thru and gotten just burgers and cheese. It's not the best thing, but it's a heck of a lot better than loading up on all these mystery things that seem to be the death by 1,000 cuts that Americans especially face today. If we can remove half of those cuts, then we maybe have half the risk. So you don't need to go full bore and go crazy, but you need to be conscious of it. And high fructose corn syrup might just be the one that's getting the attention because it's glaringly obvious and it's just terrible. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.